Hello, everybody. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Trevor Myers. I am the Student Engagement and Residential Life Coordinator here at Muscatine Community College. On behalf of myself and the rest of the MCC staff, we extend a warm welcome to you and everyone. Today, we are privileged to have among us a remarkable individual whose life bears witness to one of the darkest chapters in human history, a survivor of the Holocaust. Yvonne's presence here is a testament to the enduring power of the human spirit in the face of unspeakable adversity. As we prepare to listen to Yvonne's story, let us remember the millions whose voices were silenced by the horrors of the Second World War. May we find strength, inspiration, and above all, a renewed commitment to ensuring that the weight of history is remembered so that future generations may never forget. Once again, welcome and thank you for joining us in this important moment of remembrance and reflection. It's all yours.
Thank you. My journey began in 1887 when my great-grandparents left Vienna, Austria, and came to New York City. I had a great-grandmother until I was 12 years old, and we were the best of friends. She was an amazing lady, and she never talked about her time in New York. As I grew up and learned more and more about family history, I came to realize that they must have landed in the Jewish quarter in New York City, and that was a far cry from the life she had lived in Vienna. My grandmother was born in New York in August of 1888, and when she was 2 years old in 1890, my great-grandmother packed herself and her daughter up and went back to Vienna. My great-grandfather remained here another year, thinking his wife and child would return, and when that didn't happen, he too returned to Vienna, and that is how my family happened to be in Europe when Hitler struck in 1938. My mother was engaged to be married at that time, and she saw the handwriting on the wall and literally forced both sides of the families to leave Vienna, and they went to Brussels, Belgium. Belgium in '38 was neutral, and my mother felt everybody would be safe there. My grandmother, being an American citizen by birth, my mother forced her to leave Brussels. Now, my grandmother was a princess. She was beautiful, charming, and played bridge. She could not boil water. So she forced my grandmother to leave, and I will get back to that part of the story at a later point. The family at that point consisted of my mother's father, whom I didn't know because he passed away of a cerebral hemorrhage in English class in Brussels, so he died before I was born. I was born April 5th, 1939. I just turned 85 last week. So the rest of the family consisted of my mother's younger sister, my father, his brother, and my mother's two cousins, and my great aunt. My mother's cousins were born in Berlin, but spent more time in Vienna than in Berlin, so they were more like siblings to each other. Now came the problem of what to do and how to remain safe, and for 2 years things were pretty good, from what I was told. Sadly, in May of 1940, my father and his brother were picked up off the street in Brussels. Everybody had false papers. My father was born in Budapest, Hungary, and my mother was born in Vienna, but they weren't Belgian citizens, and the papers were obviously false papers. So my father and his brother were picked up on the street, and they were taken to a labor camp outside of Carcassonne, France. My mother's sister, younger sister by 2 years, we ended up being a family of women. My mother, my great-grandmother, my great-aunt, and my mother's younger sister. The men were gone. My mother's first cousin, Fred, he left on the last kinder transport from Brussels and ended up in Montevideo, Uruguay. His older sister, Lisa, ended up in outside of London with a Jewish family where she was a governess to their children. And she spent the entire war in that suburb until 1946 when she was able to come to America. So the rest of us were women. My great-grandmother at that time she was born in 1868, so in 1938 she was, help do me the math, whatever. She was well up in years, and she couldn't, the language in Brussels was French, and she was too old to learn the language, so as I was growing up with her, I taught myself German so that I could communicate. In any case, my mother's younger sister was picked up on the street in Brussels also, and she was taken directly to Auschwitz and killed upon arrival. My mother, my great-grandmother, my great-aunt, and I went into hiding in a Belgian convent that was taking in Jews. My mother was supposed to be a novice nun, and after passing out at the third Mass, the priest asked her not to attend Mass anymore, and she was made governess for the children in the convent. There were 25 of us. I was the only one with a parent. Food was not plentiful, and my mother would take one child every evening to share the little we had, and when she found out from some of the nuns that the Mother Superior was getting food packages from various parish priests, she approached her and asked her to share the food with the children. The Mother Superior refused. My mother and I left the convent, went back briefly to our apartment, where she became very seriously ill, the equivalent of what you call today's COVID. She was running 103, 104 fever, and the local druggist hid us in his cellar. When I went to the cellar, I had been given this doll by a Belgian friend of my mother's, and I spent my days in that cellar. Cellars in Europe are not like basements in this country. They're well below ground, they are cold, concrete, damp. There was one window with metal bars on it, and the pharmacist's wife would come down 3 times a day to tend to my mother and to bring us food, and when they closed the store at 10 o'clock at night, they came and got me and walked me around upstairs, and we would talk in whispers. There was no talking during the day whatsoever. First of all, my mother was too ill, and secondly, I was warned not to speak. So I was very obedient at that time in my life. It changed later on, but I'm no longer obedient today, but I was then. We were with the pharmacist almost 3 months, and we came out of the cellar, and my mother, through the Belgian underground, found a widow outside of Brussels in a suburb called Odergam. And the widow was a Catholic widow with an adult son. She was a wonderful, wonderful lady. And I went into open hiding, more or less, with her. Now, when I went into hiding at the widow's, there was nothing to do. I wasn't allowed to play with the children. The neighborhood was like you'd see in a Hollywood movie in the 40s, white picket fences, green shutters, flowers, gardens, children, and animals. I was not allowed to play with the neighbors at all because there was always the danger of something coming out in conversation that would jeopardize the widow and her son. So the only activity I had, she had a vegetable garden in the backyard, and we would go out and pick potatoes and carrots, peas, green beans. There was no meat. The meat was given to the soldiers at the front. She made the best French fries. I can still taste them, and none have ever been as good. Twice a week she would take me down to the local cemetery where her husband was buried, and she tended to his grave. And that was my outing. And one day went into another. When I went into hiding with the widow, I was given 5 books. These were much more involved than chapter books of today. And the widow took a nap every afternoon, and I was bored. I wasn't allowed to listen to the radio because they didn't want me to hear the war news. They figured that would upset me. And of course, no, I wasn't shown any newspapers or anything like that. So I taught myself to read. While she took a nap, I spent every afternoon. There were 5 books like that. They're all falling apart, of course. And I did teach myself to read by the time I was 3 and a half. And I read those books over and over and over again. And that pretty much saved me. It took away the boredom. It was an escape. My mother would come out every Sunday by streetcar. And one Sunday there was a streetcar strike. And I was sitting in the front hall with the doll on my lap and insisting my mother will come. And the widow was very kind and said, she can't come today, the streetcars aren't running. My mother walked 15 miles to see me. I was with the widow over 3 years. My mother never missed a Sunday. And of course, every time she came, I would ask her, when can I come back to live with you? And she would say, when the war ends, and I would ask her for a date. And she gave me a date of May 8th, 1945. She was not psychic. She just said it to appease me so I would stop asking. And of course, every time she left on Sunday, I would cry. I mean, I was a child. The widow and her son were wonderful people, and she was a very caring, kind, loving woman, but it wasn't my mother. So when the war ended, my mother came and got me. I went back to live in the city. My great-grandmother and great-aunt came out of the convent and came back to live with us. And my great-aunt was able to leave Brussels in September of 1946 and came to America to her sister, who was by that time in Chicago. So now I will tell you about my grandmother. She spoke no English, of course. She spoke German. And she landed in New York, April 6, 1939. She was met by an ex-boyfriend of my mother's who had come to the States earlier, and the family had opened a chain of leather stores in New York, which was the family business in Vienna, and he was very successful. And he gave my grandmother $100 and put her on a Greyhound bus to Chicago, where she had a friend from Vienna who was going to help her get a job. Now remember, I told you she couldn't boil water. This was at Passover time. And the friend got her a job with a Jewish family in Hyde Park, which is a southern sector of Chicago, where, as a matter of fact, where Obama has his house. She was with the family briefly. The friend gave her recipes, and my grandmother made the first batch of matzo balls, and she always said you could have played hockey with them. We're still making them from that recipe, and they did improve with time. She worked for the family very short period of time, and then she went to work for a widower who had a home in Glencoe and had been a member of the Board of Trade in Chicago. And I remember getting a picture of the two of them he had a dog, he had Lassie. He had this gorgeous collie. And I said, if and when I get to America, I want a collie like that. It was a beautiful animal. She worked for him for a couple of years in Glencoe, and then he fell on hard times and couldn't afford her to work for him. And she ended up getting a job with a lady named Harriet Adler Weil. And Harriet Adler Weil was the sister of Max Adler of the Adler Planetarium. And Max Adler was the brother-in-law of Julius Rosenwald of Sears Roebuck and the Museum of Science and Industry. And so when my great aunt came to Chicago to live with her sister. Mrs. Weil took her in, and it took us a little longer to get here. My mother would go every month to the American consul in Antwerp, and with all the paperwork, and he gave her a very hard time. She always claimed he was anti-Semitic. She couldn't prove it, but he made it very difficult for her, and it took almost 2 years to get the paperwork, but we did finally get it, and we left Brussels in March of 1947. My grandmother had friends in Chicago who had a niece in Brussels who sadly, her parents had been deported, and she ended up spending the time with the landlady of the apartment building where they had been living. And I gathered from the little we found out about it, her name was Julia, and she was Elizabeth Taylor, gorgeous, but she wouldn't really talk. And we figured in time that there must have been some kind of mental abuse that the landlady exhibited towards her, because she was stuck with taking care of that child. In any case, Julia came with us, and we left Brussels mid-March of '47. It's not a great time to cross the Atlantic. I don't recommend it. We went by train from Brussels first to Antwerp, and then changed trains and went to Copenhagen. And from Copenhagen, we took a ferry to Göteborg, Sweden, which is where the ship awaited us. It was a beautiful ship. We did not go first class. We were literally in the bowels of the ship. The ocean was very rough. I was seasick, all of us were seasick almost the entire time. The only one that never missed a meal was my great-grandmother. Sturdier stock, I think. In any case, it took us about 12 days to cross at that time, and we landed in New York Harbor, and the morning of that landing, everybody on all the decks of the ship got out on deck as we sailed by the Statue of Liberty. That to this day probably remains my most indelible memory of landing in America. It was more special than words can convey to you. My mother's first cousin, Lisa, who had come earlier and married here in America and was living in Philadelphia, she and her husband came and met the ship, and he took me around on double-decker buses for 3 days, and I got a stiff neck because all I could do was stare up at all the tall buildings, none of which we had in Europe at that time. At that point, Lisa, my mother's cousin, was going to take me by train to Chicago to meet my grandmother for the first time. And I was not happy about that. My mother decided to stay in New York a few days longer, and then she would follow. So we came to Chicago, my mother's cousin and I, and my grandmother, even so she had sent us food packages and we had pictures, it was another stranger in my life. And I again felt very disoriented. Also, I spoke no English, which was a major deterrent. Mrs. Weil took us all in. We all ended up living with her. My mother followed a few days later and took me to the local grammar school, which was called Kenwood Grammar School, not Academy. And they put me back 2 years because of language. And I lucked out in a way because the second grade teacher that they assigned me to was the daughter of German Jewish immigrants from Berlin, and she spoke a little German. And she took me home 3 times a week after school, and with the help of her parents, tutored me in English. Mrs. Weil tutored me in English 7 days a week. By the time I was here a month, I spoke English fluently and no accent. However, grammar school was not a favorite place of mine. The kids, I was doubly promoted almost within 6 months. And the kids were just not very friendly. I was a foreigner. Didn't matter that I spoke the language. And so I have no friends from grammar school at all to this day. I graduated Kenwood in June of '53. I went 2 months to Hyde Park High School, and then my mother moved us from Hyde Park to Chicago, to the north side, to Uptown actually, as it's now called. At that time it wasn't. And I was told to go and register myself in high school, and it was a Thursday. And I didn't go. I went to the movies. I was too shy to go and register myself. So that night at dinner, my mother asked me, and how did school go? And I said, I didn't go. I went to the movies. And I still remember the movie, Tea and Sympathy. So the next day, she took me to high school and registered me at Senn High School, which was a huge school on the north side, as big as Hyde Park was on the south side. I knew no one. They put me in wherever there was room, obviously, and I ended up with most of the teachers were willing to give me a couple of weeks to catch. It was midterm, and they were willing to give me a couple of weeks to catch up on the stuff they had been covering. But the English teacher, who was not an English teacher, she was a shorthand and typewriting teacher, because there was a shortage of English teachers at that time, said I had to take the test Monday morning with the rest of the class. And I said, okay. I mean, there was no way to catch up. I had been very lucky. I had wonderful English teachers at Kenwood Grammar School who prepared me for the equivalent of 4 years of high school English, because I sure didn't get anything in the first 3 years of high school English. I took the test, and as I said, I was in a homeroom with the head of the Latin department, who tried to convince me to take Latin. And I said, no, I'll stay with the French, thank you. And there were 2 girls in my homeroom, and they took me under their wing and introduced me to their friends. And I still have 2 of those friends to this day. One lives in the subdivision where I'm living, and the other one lives in LA. And we are still very close. So when the next week came, and came on Friday, and the teacher handed out the papers back, and then she made a public service announcement and said I was the only one that got 100 on the English test. At which point I would have liked to have crawled into a hole in the ground if there had been one available. I was not happy. And high school was very difficult. It's difficult under normal circumstances, and it was more difficult for me because I had been transported to so many different things over the years. So it was not a comfortable time. I did make friends. I graduated Senn in June of '57. I went to the University of Illinois, which at that time was not the Circle campus that we have today. I was part of the group of students at Navy Pier that picketed and worked hard to get that campus a reality. I met my husband-to-be in October of 1958. I married in November of 1959. I divorced many years ago, and my ex-husband passed away last year. I have 3 adult children. My oldest son is going to be 62 in August. My younger son is going to be 60 in June. And my daughter is going to be 56 in September. My older son has 3 advertising agencies that deal with the automobile industry. My younger son became an attorney, didn't like it, and went into real estate rehab, and then became a real estate broker. My daughter is a pediatric anesthesiologist and head of the liver transplant program at Children's Hospital in Cincinnati. I have 5 grandchildren ranging in ages from 35 to 16, and I have one great-grandchild that will be 11 in June. I am open to any and all questions.
So we pulled some of your questions. So the first one is, when did you begin speaking about the Holocaust, and why did you decide to speak?
My mother passed away in February of 1995, and my younger son, Richard, tried to get her to do the Shoah interview for Spielberg, and he kept pestering her, and she kept saying, no, I don't want to do this, and I finally said to him, leave her alone. And so when she passed away, he got on my case. I was more amenable. So I contacted the foundation. I said, I'll make the call. He had heard Spielberg interviewed on Larry King, and there was an 800 number, and I called it. And I told them up front, I said, I don't think they're going to want me because I was never in a camp. And he said, well, at least call. So I did, and somebody came out to interview me, and they did want to. I did the show interview. I've been doing this for the Holocaust Museum for 29 years. And I will do it as long as I'm able. Yes. Because I think it today even more important than ever. And there aren't that many of us living. I'm at the young end.
Alrighty, so then our next question we have is, how did you cope with losing your family and friends in the Holocaust?
Well, first of all, I didn't lose any friends during the Holocaust, and secondly, I really wasn't aware of family loss until much later. I mean, my mother never told me until after the war, when she got a letter from the French War Ministry saying that my father had been killed. Now, I should go back a little bit. In 1998, I went to an elder hostel at Johns Hopkins, which dealt a music elder hostel, and there were 3 of us, and we then tacked down a weekend in Washington, D.C., and I went to the Holocaust Museum there. And I wanted details. And so I got the details about my aunt right away, but they sent me, for my father, they sent me up to the main library. And the young man in charge that day said, well, do you have a transport number? And I said, if I had that, I wouldn't be here. So he gave me a book of French deportations because I told him he had been in a French labor camp, which was about yay big. And the pages were, the names on the pages were very minute. The deportation in France started in 1942. So the friend that was with me, I kept leafing through the pages. I'm 3/4 of the way through the book without any success. And I said, I can't keep doing this, it's a wasted effort. And she said to me, well, let's do a few more pages. And there at the top of one of the pages was my father's name. He had been taken in February of '44 from the labor camp to Auschwitz, and he was killed January 22nd, 1945, 5 days before the Russians liberated the camp. It's called fate.
Alrighty. The next question would be, how did the Holocaust influence your faith and your family's faith?
I don't know that it did. We are very reformed, to say the least. Obviously in Europe, we weren't able to practice anything, of course. My mother spoke fluent French and looked very Aryan. She had long blonde hair and green eyes. She would not wear a yellow armband with the Jewish star because her thinking was if they were going to get her, she was not going to be of help. She had some close encounters, but I was not with her when those happened, so it's really not my story to tell. But on one instance, she was coming to see me, and the streetcars at the that time were first, second, and third class compartments. She had a third class ticket, but she was late to catch the streetcar, so she jumped on and sat inside the first class compartment. A few blocks later, the Gestapo raided the streetcar, and when they got to first class, they called it off. And she was just inside that door. So, a lot was luck.
And then our last question would be, what message would you like to leave with the people here?
Treasure your freedom. Hard to come by.
Alrighty, thank you very much, Yvonne. Let's do it right. Did we have any more questions? Yes, go ahead. We can ask a few questions.
Just ask.
I've listened to some of the other Holocaust survivor stories from the Illinois Holocaust Museum, which is an awesome resource.
Yeah.
I'm thankful for everything they offer. And many of the survivors talked about how that they didn't talk to their children about the war and what they went through until much later in life when they were called to share the story. Was that something, when your children were young, did you talk about it?
Yes.
Okay.
My mother and I did share. And depending on the ages, when they started Sunday school, my older son started at 6, my younger son 2 years later, and they were studying the Holocaust in Sunday school, and they knew that we were not originally from America, and they knew part of our story. They knew I was born in Brussels, my mother was born in Vienna, my grandmother was born in Vienna. So they would ask questions, and yes, we always answered, whatever was age appropriate.
I know we have a few pictures in the slideshow. Would you mind if I go to the next slide and you tell us who was
Sure.
who?
Where are you?
Ready.
Those were my great-grandparents' citizenship papers when they came to New York. That was my great-grandmother. My great-grandfather, whom I did not know, he passed away before I was born. My grandmother, my mother and her younger sister, my grandmother with her 2 daughters on a street in Vienna, probably near their apartment building. And this was my mother's father, whom I also didn't know. My parents on their wedding day. My great-grandmother holding me as when I was a baby, and the lower left, my father is the only picture I have of my father holding me. The woman in the lower picture was the woman who gave me the doll and the books, and that was the widow Jean Stevens and her son Charles. I'll get back to a story. This was taken, my mother had formal pictures taken in 1948 when we were in Chicago. This was my father's stepfather, actually, husband from the second marriage. The lower picture of my mother was when she got to Chicago in 1947. Those are the cousins. And the Fred he was on the Olympic diving team. There was a sporting club in Vienna, a Jewish sporting club, and he was on their swim team and of course couldn't compete in 1936 at the Olympics. But he did compete in Uruguay. These are my children. My older son with his family, my younger son, and my daughter and son-in-law and their 2 children. I went back to Europe with my husband in August of '61. And sadly, the widow had passed away in November of '60 of a cerebral hemorrhage. But we did a 9-week European trip. 8 weeks we drove, and the last week we stayed in Paris. I went back to Brussels. My mother's friend from the war years and the older daughter was still living there, and so we had a reunion. And I went and made a date to see the son. By that time he was married and had a son of his own, but he was still living in the same house. The only thing was that now it was not a suburb. It became part of Brussels proper, so it was very metropolitan. And nothing had changed in the house from the time I had been there last until I went back. So it was a little bittersweet, is the best way I can describe it. 8 years ago, my daughter wanted to do a family history trip. And so we went to Vienna, Berlin, and Brussels. We started in Vienna, and while we were doing, I told my son-in-law, who had wanted to do all the museums and stuff, I said, look, we've got 2 young children here who were at that time were 8 and almost 12. I said, that's not for them. We're going to do kid-friendly stuff. So we did the Sound of Music tour. We went to the Spanish writing school, and while I'm at the Spanish writing school, my phone kept dinging. So I looked down, and all my friends knew where I was, so I couldn't imagine what it was. So as I looked down, I see a post, bombing at the Brussels airport. And we're in Vienna. So we had a flight to Berlin. My mother remarried in 1963 to a wonderful gentleman who was from Berlin, and he left Berlin in 1933. When they married, he adopted me. I was already married and had a child. So that tells you something about the character of the man. He was a great guy. I wanted to go to Berlin because of him. And so we did all the touristy things in Berlin. But we couldn't fly from Berlin to Brussels. So now we had to juggle. How are we going to get to Brussels? So the only option was train. And there's now one train that goes from Berlin to Brussels. There are 2 trains. And it was Easter weekend. But we got to Brussels. And I hired a car on Easter Sunday that took us around to all of the places where I had lived and spent time. And I did that with my children. And to this day, they talk about that. So it was very worthwhile, very special. And I've been very lucky. I've traveled the world. I'm more than grateful.
We have a question right over there.
Yes, on the day I came when I was 16. My mother said, my sister was a war bride. My mother said, you go to America and help your sister. She had 3 little ones and a husband, of course. They went to work to build a new home in wonderful America. But before I came, I never heard about what happened to the Jewish people, God's people. When people say lucky, I said, please don't say that. That's for gamblers. I say I was blessed to come over, you know? But to each his own. So I came over, but when I was little, I was born 38. You were a year old. And I was the 7th of 13 children when my family was done. And when people make snobby comment about it, I get a little upset. I said, if we're in a bombing, we were Schweinfurt, Frankfurt. Schweinfurt had ball bearing factories. Of course the enemy wants to ball bearing. Some people don't even know what ball bearing is. It makes a car, it makes the tank, it makes the radio, the bicycles. Kept us moving. But it was so bad. One of many times we had a little supper that then it was getting bad from the east to the west, Schweinfurt on the Rhine, was mine. And to make the story short, if there is such a thing, we were just starting to eat, and the third alarm. The first was mild, you didn't have to hurry, you had time to blow your nose, whatever. But the second, you better get ready, whatever. And then the third, Mom grabbed us and we all went down to our cellar. It's amazing. She had bunk beds down there, white sheets, that's all there was. And there was no pennies in Walmart, by the way. And she did what she could. So at that time, I was the seventh, and then she had twins after me. And so my oldest two sisters were a lot of help, they were teenagers. She wanted to go across the street. Because when you're a mother of 3, 4 children, you like to see some grown-ups once in a while and exchange what's life about. Well, it started to bomb when you were over there, and she wanted to go in, we had our own cellar. And he said, no, you can come in with the little ones, but not the big ones. But mother can say that. She didn't say it, he did. So we come back to our street, and I remember holding on to my mama like this, excuse me, and I was just 3. And I said, anything that happens, I just want to go with my mama. So we went down to the cellar. To make the story short, my mom went to the authority and said, can't do it anymore. You have, let's see, I was 6, they were 8. Heidi and Kurt. Somebody know Kurt Boucher? He did a lot of yodeling. And so to make the story short, we moved to a village. Thank God that first night we could go through a sleep without bombing. And I remember the bad time, but when we went to the village, it was peaceful. Little did we know, a half a mile up the hill was the Russian border. People came from the border and wanted food. My mom helped all she could. One day they took the sled that my dad made. They needed it. Mom just put up, she let them sleep at the house. Then the Americans came. A tank came into the Austadt. We were in a corner house. And my little brother Kurt, since you know him, he was ornery too. He was only about 3, 4 years old. And Mom couldn't find him. It's only little ones and another one on the way. That was just life. And also child diseases came when there were so many children right before that. So she was just born to be a good mother. And he stopped the tank. And my mom, we were all told to stay in the house. I'm not a good storyteller, honey. But Mom was out, and here comes this high officer with, may I demonstrate on this? Had my little brother like this on his shirt. He said, you, Mama? Yeah? And he said, you, spank him. She said, 9. You spank him.
Alrighty, thank you very much for.
Thank God we're Americans.
Yes, thank you. Alrighty, we have time for just a couple more questions. Already in the back. Would you like the microphone?
No, I think I can talk pretty loud. First of all, it's amazing that you're here. Thank you for coming and talking.
Yes. My pleasure.
And my question is, how do you think growing up and hiding and having to learn that it's not okay to go outside and play with other kids, how do you think that, changed you growing up?
Everything you experience in a lifetime changes you, and everything leaves its mark. For me, I was extremely shy well into adulthood, into my 30s, late 30s. I owe my stepfather a great deal for being able to share, not this story. He sadly passed away in 1974, and my mother and I were left with the business. And I had asked him to teach me how to, he was a printing broker, We were manufacturers reps in the printing industry. And I asked him to teach me how to figure jobs in the after lunch. And he said, "What do you need that for? There are no women in the industry." I said, "Teach me." So he did. Basics, nothing very convoluted. When he passed away, my mother and I had the business, and it was a matter of deciding what do we do. And we didn't want to let the business go. And my mother was not willing to go out and sell. Now, the furthest thing from my mind would have ever been to go into sales. I was really not cut out for it by any stretch. But it became a matter of sink or swim. My mother wouldn't do it. She was going to man the office. So I went door to door. The house accounts weren't a problem because the purchasing agents, who were male, were very good to us and knew us. And in many instances, I had gone with my dad on customer calls, so I had gotten to know some of them that way. However, anything new, there were no women in printing sales in 1976. So it was not an easy time. They were not very welcoming when they saw a woman. They just weren't. But I fought through it, and I kept going and kept the business going until 2010.
Alrighty, and
then I retired. I kept it for 75 years in honor of my dad.
Well done.
all right, we have one last question right here.
I was married to a Jewish man from Russia, and he talked about prejudice that when he was graduated as a PhD from the university, he was president of RCA, very well known. But he was prejudiced. If you lived in Maine, you couldn't be Jewish. If you lived you'd be Presbyterian. Did you have that?
No.
Wherever they lived, they could not be Jewish because there was so much prejudice against Jews.
Well, I only ever lived in two places, Brussels.
You lived all over, and he just said they could never be. And I thought how horrible that would be to not be able to be who you are.
I can't identify with that because it's not my experience. In Brussels, we couldn't be Jewish. And even after the war, I went to a Catholic school because that was the grammar school that was available in the area of Brussels where we were living.
And they ended up in Sarasota, Florida, which I did also, and then in Sarasota you could be. But
I'm sure there are many stories like that. When we lived in Hyde Park, my mother went to the temple in Hyde Park, which was very reformed, Temple Sinai. They knew we were immigrants, and my mother said, we can't really afford your membership. Would you do any accommodations? And they would not do it. So I did not belong to a temple until my kids went to Sunday school. And then we joined Sholem on Lakeshore Drive, across from the totem pole with Aronson, if anybody knows that.
Alrighty, last question.
Have you wrote a story or any book form?
I did the Shoah interview, and a number of years ago when I was at the museum, there were school children from Rock Island, and they asked if they could do my story. And so they wrote it. I made the corrections as whatever, they were minor. There is a book, not written by me, called What Doesn't Break You Makes You, and Amazon does have it.
Thank you.
Alrighty,
I mean, it's very, you have to realize it was written by kids, fifth and sixth graders.
It has a fair amount, or some.
It does, it has the basics. It doesn't have everything I've given you today.
alrighty, well, thank you very much for your time today, Yvonne.
Thank you for coming.